call Gareth Hughes.
Mr Speaker, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, kia ora. I'd like to share the practice in this House of acknowledging our troops in and out of uniform. I'd like to acknowledge the families and loved ones from those Kiwis that have died overseas in service. As we look around the room, you see the places that Kiwis have served with distinction over the decades. Mr Speaker, I'm very happy to take a call on this bill because I come from a naval family. Mum and Dad met in the New Zealand Navy. Despite probably what they wanted, I went off and joined the hippie Navy, sailing on the Rainbow Warrior. And in fact, my first touch of the Defence Forces was actually being assaulted, Mr Speaker, on the network news when the Labour government got rid of the Skyhawks. When I went to protest, the protest was about the ditching of the Skyhawks. Mr Speaker, that was a tough decision that Labour took. They were under a lot of pressure, and we should be learning the lessons, because what we need in 2012 is an independent Defence Force fit for purpose. And Mr Speaker, our fears in the Green Party and throughout New Zealand is that our Defence Forces aren't fit for purpose. They're fit to be a key cog in the United States and other Western military processes. So Mr Speaker, when we look around this room and look at those Kiwis that have lost their lives, we want to make sure they're doing it in the interests of justice internationally, in the interest of democracy. Now, the Green Party approach to this issue is we support an independent foreign policy. We support a non-violent diplomatic approach to conflict. We don't want to be tied into those old alliances of the past. We don't want to be going into illegal wars, such as Iraq. We don't want to be going into illegal wars like Iraq under false pretences, like we've seen in New Zealand and saw in Nikki Hager's book, Other People's War. Mr Speaker, this bill, the Defence Amendment Act, makes a number of smaller changes, looking at the increased collaboration between New Zealand Defence Forces and the Ministry of Defence. It gives the Chief of Defence Force more authority to directly manage the Navy, Army and Air Force. We believe the bill is in fact a step towards the reintegration of the New Zealand Defence Forces and the Ministry of Defence, as recommended in the Hun report, reversing this process we've seen in the last 2 decades, the separation of civilian and military systems. Mr Speaker, this bill is about cuts. This bill is about increasing civilianisation, changes to territorial forces. Mr Speaker, we've seen over the last term and a half of this government's economic plan. We know the plan. We've seen the drill it part of it. We've seen the mine it part of it. We're seeing the sell it part of it right now. And here we are, graphic evidence of the cut it part of it. Mr Speaker, this bill is going to see cuts on the order of $400 million a year from the Defence Forces. We're going to be cutting the territorials by a third. We're cutting 7 out of 10 military bands, Mr Speaker, and we're seeing hundreds and hundreds of uniform jobs going to civilian. This bill is about cuts to go with the drill it, mine it, cut it, sell it. It comes from the White Paper, the Hun report from 2002. The White Report looked at our strategic environment and looked at the threats over the next 25 years. It said it is going to be a more challenging strategic environment over the next 25 years, highlights threats such as the fragility of the Pacific, terrorism a continuing threat, and also highlighted a particular threat to us down in the bottom of the world in the South Pacific, illegal migration. A point missing, of course, from the Defence Force from this Defence report, the Hun report, was the role of climate change. We know we're likely to see literally hundreds of millions of climate refugees from those delta regions from around the world. And the way our Defence Forces are set up, they're not fit for purpose. We've got these floating white elephants, these more than 600 million, although I wonder what the cost is now, these frigates costing $400 million a year to run these 2 frigates. So while we're looking at cuts, let's look at more appropriate ways we could be saving the New Zealand taxpayer money. And what we'd rather see is cuts to those frigates, those floating white elephants, not the military bands, not the increasing civilianisation. We've got $600 million for new air defences, the frigates, the $900 million for new helicopters. If we had an independent foreign policy, if we were trying to design our defence forces for fit for purpose, we'd be making different decisions. It's disappointing to see Labour supporting this bill because the Greens will be opposing it. We're going to take a constructive approach in the Select Committee. But ultimately, Mr Speaker, all in all, what we want to see is a promotion of independence from New Zealand, and what we see, and this is a result of the White Paper, is this bill is all about being a stalwart ally of the United States, so outlining so blatantly in the Hun report, Mr Speaker. Kia ora.
Louise Upston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There's been a